The villagers whispered its name only in hushed tones, as if the mere mention could summon its curse. The house where time stopped. Nestled deep within the tangled claws of the blackwood forest, the house stood alone, its decaying frame slouched against the earth like a corpse reluctant to decompose. The surrounding air was thick, almost tangible, carrying the scent of rot, iron, and something far worse. For as long as anyone could remember, no one had entered the house and returned sane. Those who dared to venture close would stumble back, babbling incoherently about shadows that moved like liquid and whispers that crawled into their skulls. Yet, despite its reputation, the house was oddly untouched by time. Its blackened walls, though cracked and peeling, seemed impervious to decay. The windows, covered in grime, gave the illusion of being abandoned, but some swore they'd seen faint flickers of light within, as though it were alive and watching. The stories were endless. Children dared each other to touch its front gate, but never made it past the gnarled iron fence that encircled the property. Hunters claimed to hear the clockwork like ticking echoing from within its walls, though no clocks were ever found. And then, of course, there was the tale of the missing family, for souls who'd moved in decades ago and were never seen again. It was said that the house wasn't just a place but a trap. Once you stepped inside, time itself would unravel. Minutes stretched into days, and days into eternity. The clocks within the house, long dead and rusted, began to tick once more, but backward. The air inside was suffocating, heavy with a presence that clawed at the minds of its victims. The walls would shift, the rooms would change, and soon, the house would consume you. The town's latest curiosity with the house began when a faded photograph surfaced in the local library. A photo of the missing family. They stared back from the yellowed paper with lifeless eyes, dressed in clothes from a time no one could place. The man wore a threadbare suit, his hand resting stiffly on the shoulder of his wife, whose face was frozen in an eerie half-smile. But it was the children, two young girls, who unsettled anyone who looked too long. Their expressions were hollow, their eyes reflecting something more than fear. And clutched in the youngest girl's hand was a pocket watch, its face cracked, yet still ticking. The photo reignited old fears, and once again, whispers about the house slithered through the town. Most avoided speaking of it directly, but curiosity is a poison that works slowly. By the time Jacob Lynch decided he'd investigate the house, no one was surprised. Jacob, a scrappy 28-year-old drifter, was new in town and scoffed at what he called ghost stories for bored old men. He needed cash, and rumors swirled that someone had offered a hefty reward to anyone who could uncover what was inside the house. No one would admit who made the offer, of course, but Jacob didn't care. Money was money. With a flashlight in one hand and a crowbar in the other, Jacob set out one moonless night, his breath fogging in the frigid air. The townsfolk watched from behind curtained windows as he made his way toward the edge of Blackwood Forest. No one called out to stop him. No one warned him again. Why bother? When Jacob reached the house, he paused only briefly, staring at the iron gate wrapped in ivy, so dark it appeared black. The gate creaked open on its own with a sound that made his skin crawl, but he convinced himself it was just the wind. The house loomed ahead, its silhouette jagged and uneven, like broken teeth against the starless sky. He climbed the porch stairs cautiously, each step groaning beneath his weight. The front door was massive, carved with intricate patterns of swirling vines and what looked like strange symbols. He ran his hand across the carvings, feeling the grooves, before noticing something wet. When he pulled his hand back, it was smeared with a deep red substance. Blood? No, he thought, it was probably just some kind of rust. The door wasn't locked. The moment Jacob stepped inside, the air changed. It felt thick, heavy, like he was walking into a room filled with smoke. His flashlight flickered, the beam sputtering weakly against the oppressive darkness. The interior of the house was worse than he imagined. The walls were lined with warped wallpaper that seemed to pulse, as though it were breathing. The furniture, what little remained, was overturned, rotted, and covered in a layer of dust so thick it seemed to muffle every sound. Then he heard it, a faint ticking, Jacob froze. The sound came from deeper within the house, steady and deliberate, like the heartbeat of some terrible creature. He followed it, his boots crunching on a floor littered with debris, broken glass, splintered wood, and something that squelched unpleasantly underfoot. The ticking grew louder as he approached what appeared to be the living room. The air here was colder, and the stench of decay was overwhelming. In the center of the room was an old grandfather clock, its face cracked, but its hands moving backward. Jacob's breath hitched as he noticed something even stranger. The room was filled with dozens of clocks, all different shapes and sizes, all in various states of disrepair, and all ticking in reverse. That was when the whispers started. At first, they were faint, like the rustling of leaves. But they grew louder, overlapping and twisting into incomprehensible words. Jacob spun around, his flashlight beam cutting through the room, but there was nothing. No one. The whispers seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere all at once. The floor beneath him creaked ominously, and before he could react, it gave way, sending him crashing into the darkness below. He landed hard on what felt like damp earth, his flashlight skittering away. When he scrambled to grab it, the beam illuminated the surrounding space, and his stomach turned. The basement was a graveyard. Bones, human bones, were strewn across the dirt floor, some broken, others arranged in deliberate patterns. The walls were lined with shelves that held jars filled with unidentifiable, pulsating masses that twitched under the glass. And there in the center of the room was a table. On it lay the same pocket watch from the photograph, its cracked face glowing faintly in the dark. The ticking grew, deafening now, each tick a hammer blow in his skull. Jacob staggered back, his eyes darting wildly for an escape, but the walls seemed to close in around him. He tried to climb back up, but the hole he'd fallen through was gone, replaced by solid, pulsing wood. Then he saw them. The family from the photograph stood in the shadows, their faces pale and lifeless. The father stepped forward, his jaw hanging unnaturally low, revealing rows of jagged teeth. The mother reached out a skeletal hand, her fingers impossibly long. The children giggled, a sound that sent shivers down Jacob's spine. As they crept closer, their empty eyes locked on him. "Stay," they whispered in unison, their voices blending into the relentless ticking. "Stay and stop the time." Jacob screamed as the family lunged toward him, their faces distorting into monstrous shapes. The last thing he saw before everything went dark was the little girl's hand reaching for the pocket watch, her grin widening unnaturally as she clicked it open. Jacob's scream was swallowed by the dark, suffocating silence that followed. When he opened his eyes, he was no longer in the basement. Instead, he found himself standing in a long, narrow hallway, lit only by a dim, flickering light that seemed to have no source. The air was freezing, his breath condensing in shaky puffs as he tried to orient himself. The hallway stretched endlessly in both directions, lined with doors of varying shapes and sizes. Some were ornate, carved with intricate designs. Others were plain, their wooden surfaces splintered and cracked. But each door had one thing in common. Behind them, faint sounds could be heard. Jacob's ears strained as he stepped closer to the nearest one. From behind the door came the soft, rhythmic tapping of fingernails against glass, like someone or something waiting patiently. The next door emitted a low, guttural growl that made his stomach churn. And from further down the hallway, the sound of a child's laughter echoed, sweet and innocent yet somehow horribly wrong. "Stay," a voice whispered behind him. Jacob spun around, but the hallway was empty. His flashlight was gone, leaving him with no choice but to stumble forward in the dim light. He reached out to the walls for balance, but as his fingers grazed the surface, he recoiled in horror. The walls were warm, fleshy, and pulsing, like the inside of something alive. His heart pounded as he moved further down the corridor, trying to ignore the increasingly loud noises coming from the surrounding doors. Whispers grew louder, overlapping with cries, screams, and strange, wet squelching sounds. One door rattled violently on its hinges, as if whatever was inside was trying to claw its way out. Jacob quickened his pace, his panic rising. The hallway seemed to stretch on forever, but just as he began to think he'd never find an end, he saw it. A single door at the very end of the corridor. Unlike the others, this one was pristine, painted a stark white and framed by glowing golden light. There was no sound behind it, only silence. A part of him screamed to turn back, but the other doors offered no escape, only terror. Gritting his teeth, Jacob reached for the handle. The moment his fingers touched the cold metal, the hallway went deathly silent. Every sound ceased, and even the pulsing walls stilled. The door creaked open, revealing a room bathed in warm, golden light. For a brief moment, Jacob felt relief as he stepped inside. The room was small and simple, furnished with an antique armchair, a side table, and a roaring fireplace. On the mantel above the fire sat the pocket watch, its cracked face glinting in the firelight. He approached cautiously, his eyes fixed on the watch. The ticking was louder now, a steady rhythm that seemed to vibrate through his very bones. He reached out to pick it up, but the moment his fingers brushed the metal, the light in the room flickered, and then died. Jacob was plunged into darkness once more, but this time he wasn't alone. The air grew heavy, pressing down on him like an invisible weight. A low, guttural breathing filled the room, coming from all around him. He stumbled backward, his eyes straining to see, but the darkness was impenetrable. "Why did you come here?" A voice rasped, deep and ancient, as if it had crawled up from the bowels of the earth. Jacob's throat was dry, his voice barely a whisper. I don't know," he stammered. The breathing grew louder, closer. "You seek what you do not understand. The house does not forgive trespassers." Suddenly, a pale light flickered to life, illuminating the room once more. Jacob gasped as he saw what surrounded him. The family from the photograph stood in a circle around him, their faces blank and lifeless. But their forms were grotesquely distorted now. The father's arms were impossibly long, his fingers tipped with blackened claws. The mother's mouth stretched unnaturally wide, rows of jagged teeth glistening in the dim light. The children were the worst. One had no eyes, only hollow, bleeding sockets, while the other's neck was twisted at an angle that defied logic. "You must take our place," the father growled, his voice a horrible gurgle. Jacob stumbled backward, shaking his head. No, I didn't mean." The little girl stepped forward, the pocket watch now dangling from her tiny fingers. "It's your turn," she whispered, her voice sweet but dripping with malice. She clicked the watch open, and the room began to spin. The golden light turned blood red, and the walls began to close in. The family lunged toward him, their limbs bending and twisting unnaturally as they reached out with clawed hands. Jacob screamed as they dragged him to the floor, their faces inches from his as they whispered incomprehensible words. The pocket watch began to tick faster, the sound piercing his ears, growing louder and louder until he woke up. Jacob found himself lying on the cold, hard ground just outside the house. The sun was rising, casting an eerie glow over the blackwood forest. For a moment, he thought it had all been a nightmare, but when he looked down, he saw the pocket watch clenched in his hand. Its cracked face reflected the morning light, and the hands were still ticking backward. He stood, trembling, and stumbled back toward the town. But as he reached the outskirts, he noticed something strange. The streets were empty, the houses abandoned and crumbling. The air was stale, and the sky had a sickly, grayish hue. Jacob's heart sank as he realized the truth. The town was gone. Or rather, it had never been there. Time had swallowed it, just as the house had promised. And now, he was alone, trapped in a world where nothing moved forward, and the only sound was the relentless ticking of the watch in his hand. Jacob staggered through the empty streets of the strange, abandoned town. Every house, every shop, every cobblestone bore an unnatural stillness, as though frozen in a single moment of decay. Vines with blackened leaves crawled over the buildings, their tendrils eerily still, yet they seemed to pulse faintly, as though alive. The sky above was wrong. There were no clouds, no sun, just an endless gray void that hummed faintly, vibrating at the edge of his senses. "Hello?" Jacob's voice cracked as it echoed off the lifeless structures, disappearing into the void. No response, not even the sound of birds, wind, or insects. Just silence, and the faint ticking of the pocket watch in his hand. He wanted to throw it away, to smash it into the ground and run, but the thought of being without it filled him with a deep, irrational dread. It wasn't just an object anymore. It felt like it was part of him, tethered to his very existence. Jacob stumbled toward what should have been the town square, though the layout was warped and unfamiliar now. The streets twisted unnaturally, folding into impossible angles that seemed to loop back on themselves. As he turned a corner, he stopped dead in his tracks. There, standing in the center of the square, was a figure. It was a man, or at least it had been at one point. His back was to Jacob, his body unnaturally stiff, as though he were a mannequin left in the rain. His clothes were tattered and gray, blending almost seamlessly with the lifeless backdrop of the town. "Hey!" Jacob called out, his voice trembling with a mixture of fear and relief. You there? What's happening? Where am I?" The figure didn't move. Jacob stepped closer, the pocket watch in his hand, ticking faster with each step. "Do you hear me? I need help." As he approached, the figure began to move, but not like a person. The motion was jerky, broken, as if invisible strings were pulling it into place. Its head twisted sharply, snapping around to face him, and Jacob froze. The man's face was hollow, literally. There were no eyes, no mouth, just a blank, pale surface where features should have been. Yet somehow, Jacob felt it staring at him, its emptiness burning into his soul. The figure raised one hand, pointing directly at him. Jacob stumbled back, his breath coming in ragged gasps. No, stay away." The figure's hand snapped back down, and it began to lurch toward him, each step accompanied by a sickening crunch that sounded like bones grinding against each other. Jacob turned and ran, the sound of its shambling pursuit echoing behind him. He didn't know where he was going. There was no clear direction, no escape. The streets shifted as he ran, buildings melting into one another like wax under a flame. His footsteps seemed to grow louder, heavier, as if the ground beneath him were trying to pull him in. He turned another corner and skidded to a halt. More figures stood in the street ahead, their faceless heads tilted unnaturally toward him. Men, women, children, all frozen in poses of distorted agony, their bodies twisted as though they'd been broken and reassembled incorrectly. As one, they began to move, their heads snapping toward him like marionettes brought to life. Jacob stumbled backward, his foot catching on a loose stone. He fell hard, the pocket watch tumbling from his grip and skittering across the ground. It stopped a few feet away, its ticking impossibly loud now, echoing in his skull like a countdown. The figures closed in, their movements synchronized and unnatural, their blank faces filling his vision. He scrambled for the watch, his fingers closing around it just as their cold, lifeless hands grabbed him. The moment he touched the watch, the world around him shattered. The figures dissolved into black smoke, the streets crumbled beneath him, and Jacob was falling into an endless abyss. The ticking of the watch grew louder, faster, until it became a deafening roar. When he hit the ground, it wasn't the hard, cold surface he expected. Instead, it was soft, damp, and warm. He opened his eyes to find himself back inside the house, lying on the pulsing, fleshy floor of the hallway. The doors loomed above him, their whispers now deafening. No, he shouted, clutching the pocket watch as though it could protect him. The hallway twisted and stretched, the doors bending inward, their frames warping into jagged, tooth-like shapes. Shadows spilled from the cracks beneath them, slithering toward him like living things. He scrambled to his feet, clutching the watch so tightly his knuckles turned white. "You can't leave," the voices whispered, overlapping and echoing in his mind. Not without paying the price. The pocket watch began to burn in his hand, searing his palm, but he couldn't let go. The heat spread through his arm, up into his chest, and he screamed as it felt like his heart was being ripped apart. Take our place, the voices demanded. Balance the time. Through the pain, Jacob realized what the house wanted, what it needed. Every soul it consumed was part of a cycle, an endless loop of torment to keep the house alive. And now it was his turn to become part of the machinery, another gear in the infernal clockwork. The doors around him burst open, and from each one emerged the faceless figures, their arms outstretched, their whispers drowning out every thought in his head. The watch in his hand began to tick backward faster and faster until the hands were a blur. "No," he screamed, raising the watch above his head. "You won't take me." With all his strength, he slammed the watch into the ground. The world exploded into light. Jacob opened his eyes to find himself standing in front of the house once more. The sun was rising, the air crisp and clear. The house stood silent and still, its windows dark and lifeless. For a moment, he thought he had escaped, but when he looked down, he saw it. The pocket watch was still in his hand, its face glowing faintly. And as he stared at it, the ticking began again, slow and steady. Behind him, the house groaned, its door creaking open just slightly, an invitation. Jacob knew he would never leave. The house had claimed him, and the cycle would begin again. Jacob stood frozen in place, staring at the pocket watch in his trembling hand. Its ticking had slowed, quieter now, but it echoed inside his head as though the sound was stitched into the fabric of his thoughts. He looked back at the house, its once solid form appearing warped, as if it was breathing with anticipation. The door, ajar, seemed to mock him, a dark mouth that promised only suffering. "No," Jacob muttered, shaking his head. "I'm not going back in there." He turned, his legs unsteady, but moving away from the house, toward the forest's edge. The blackwood trees loomed ahead, their twisted trunks forming a natural wall. Though the air beyond them seemed darker than the world around him, Jacob felt a desperate hope that whatever waited there was better than returning to the house. As he reached the tree-line, the pocket watch vibrated violently in his grip, almost as if it were alive. He stopped, clutching his wrist as the vibration grew stronger, the ticking faster, louder. The edges of his vision blurred, and the world seemed to tilt. Then the whispers returned. "You cannot run," they hissed, slithering through the air like venomous snakes. "The house will not let you go." Jacob spun around, his heart hammering in his chest. The house was closer now, impossibly close, despite him walking away from it. Its windows gleamed like blackened eyes, watching, waiting. "I can't do this," Jacob said aloud, his voice cracking. "There has to be a way out." But as the whispers grew louder, a memory surfaced in his mind, something he'd almost forgotten in the chaos. The book, the one he'd found in the study before everything spiraled into madness. It had mentioned the house's curse, the cycle it demanded. There had been words scrawled in the margins, almost illegible, but one phrase burned itself into his memory now. To break the cycle, time must be sacrificed. What does that even mean? Jacob whispered, gripping the watch tightly. His thoughts raced. Was it his time? His life? Or something worse? The forest began to shift around him, the trees twisting and bending unnaturally, their branches reaching toward him like skeletal hands. The air grew heavier, colder, and then, in the distance, he saw it. A figure standing between the trees, its outline barely visible in the shadows. "Hello," Jacob called, his voice shaking. "Who's there?" The figure didn't respond, but it began to move toward him, its steps slow and deliberate. As it grew closer, Jacob's breath caught in his throat. The figure was a man, or what was left of one. His face was gaunt, his eyes sunken and black, his skin pale and stretched tight over his bones. His clothes were old, tattered, and stained with something dark and dried. But it was his hands that drew Jacob's attention. In the man's hands was a pocket watch, identical to the one Jacob held. The man stopped a few feet away, his hollow eyes locking onto Jacob's. "You're trapped, too," he rasped, his voice dry and cracked. Jacob took a step back, shaking his head. I don't know what you mean. I'm trying to leave. I just want to leave." The man tilted his head, a slow, unnatural motion. "There is no leaving. The house won't let you. It never does." Jacob felt his knees weaken. Then how do I stop it? How do I end this? The man raised his watch, his bony fingers curling around it like claws. You don't stop it. You survive it. Or you become part of it. Before Jacob could respond, the man's body began to convulse, his limbs jerking violently, as if an invisible force was pulling him apart. He let out a guttural scream as his form twisted, his flesh tearing and melting until he was nothing but a mass of black smoke. The smoke coiled and writhed, forming shapes that seemed almost human, faces screaming silently before dissipating into the air. Jacob stumbled backward, his hands shaking so violently he nearly dropped the watch. The surrounding whispers grew louder, more insistent. The forest was alive now, the trees groaning and creaking as they closed in, their branches scraping against each other like nails on a chalkboard. The words from the book echoed in his mind again. To break the cycle, time must be sacrificed. He looked down at the watch in his hand, its cracked face glowing faintly in the dim light. The hands were spinning backward now, faster and faster, as though counting down to something. Jacob felt a cold dread settle in his stomach. What if it's my time? He whispered. What if that's the sacrifice? The whispers seemed to laugh, a chorus of mocking voices that made his skin crawl. Time is the only price, they intoned. Time or eternity. Jacob clenched his jaw, his mind racing. If destroying the watch hadn't worked, then what? Did he have to give himself to the house entirely? Or was there another way? Suddenly, the forest parted before him, and Jacob found himself standing in front of the house once more. Its door was wide open now, revealing only darkness within. The house seemed to pulse, its walls breathing in anticipation. He realized then that he didn't have a choice. Whatever the sacrifice was, whatever the house demanded, it would happen here. With a deep, shuddering breath, Jacob stepped through the threshold. The door slammed shut behind him, and the world outside vanished. The house was alive now, its walls shifting and groaning. The hallway stretched endlessly before him, the doors on either side glowing faintly, their whispers louder than ever. But this time, Jacob didn't stop. He walked forward with purpose, clutching the watch tightly. The ticking was erratic now, almost frantic, as though it were trying to warn him. At the end of the hallway, a single door waited. It was massive, ornate, carved with symbols he didn't recognize but instinctively feared. The surrounding air was cold, and the sound of a clock chiming echoed faintly from within. Jacob placed his hand on the door. The whispers stopped. The house fell silent. The door swung open, revealing a room bathed in a dim, golden light. At its center was a massive clock, its face cracked and weathered, its hands spinning wildly in every direction. The room pulsed with an unnatural energy, and Jacob felt his heart racing as he stepped inside. The whispers returned, louder now, a deafening roar that seemed to come from the clock itself. Sacrifice, they demanded. Time must be paid. Jacob looked down at the pocket watch in his hand. He knew what he had to do. With a scream, he hurled the watch into the clock's face. The room exploded with light, and the last thing Jacob heard was the sound of shattering glass as the world around him dissolved into chaos. Jacob's scream echoed into the void as the shattered fragments of the great clock scattered into 1,000 glittering shards, each piece dissolving into the golden light that surrounded him. His body felt weightless, suspended in a vortex of nothingness. For a moment, there was silence. No whispers, no ticking, only the sensation of time slipping away from him like water through his fingers. Then the house returned. But it was no longer the house he had entered. The hallway was gone, replaced by an endless expanse of black, with faint, glowing shapes suspended in the distance. Floating fragments of furniture, torn wallpaper, and twisted shadows moved around him like debris in a whirlpool. Jacob turned in circles, clutching his chest as he tried to breathe, his mind reeling. Where am I?" he whispered, his voice barely audible in the oppressive void. The whispers responded, but this time, they weren't scattered or disjointed. They spoke in unison, a low and terrible harmony that reverberated through his very bones. You are inside the mechanism. You are inside time itself. Jacob's gaze darted around, searching for the source of the voice, but there was nothing. Only darkness and the faint, golden glow of the fragments drifting around him. His pocket watch was gone, and with it, the last thread tethering him to any sense of reality. "No," he said, his voice cracking. "This isn't real. I broke the watch. I broke the clock. I'm supposed to be free." The voices laughed, a chilling, hollow sound. "There is no freedom. There never was. You have only traded one form of servitude for another." Suddenly, the fragments around him began to coalesce, swirling together into a monstrous shape. The golden shards formed gears and cogs, spinning and grinding as they built themselves into a colossal, otherworldly construct. At its center was a clock face, cracked and glowing, its hands spinning in erratic, impossible patterns. The clock's surface shimmered with reflections of countless faces, men, women, and children, all frozen in expressions of agony and despair. Jacob staggered backward, his eyes wide with terror. What is this?" "This is the heart of the house," the voices intoned. "This is the cycle, the mechanism, and now you are part of it." As the words sank in, Jacob felt his body grow heavy, his limbs stiffening as if they were being encased in stone. He looked down and saw his skin darkening, turning gray and brittle like aged wood. His veins glowed faintly with golden light, pulsing in time with the clock's erratic rhythm. "No!" he screamed, clawing at his arms, his chest, trying to stop the transformation. "I won't become part of this. I won't." But it was too late. The house had claimed him. The clock's hands slowed, settling into a steady, deliberate rhythm. The gears surrounding it began to grind in unison, their movements smooth and precise. Jacob's body continued to harden, his screams fading as his voice was swallowed by the mechanism. His eyes, wide with terror, reflected the glowing face of the clock one last time before they too turned to glass. And then he was still. Jacob's frozen form was absorbed into the machinery, another cog in the endless cycle of the house. The whispers fell silent, replaced by the steady ticking of the clock. The golden light dimmed, and the void dissolved, leaving behind the house as it had always been, silent, empty, waiting. Days, weeks, or perhaps years later, time was meaningless within the house. The door creaked open once more. A young woman stood on the threshold, her face pale as she stared into the darkened hallway. She clutched a faded map in one hand, the edges worn and torn, and in the other, a flashlight that flickered weakly. "Hello," she called out, her voice trembling. Is anyone here?" The hallway seemed to breathe, its walls shifting imperceptibly as the shadows deepened. The woman hesitated, her instincts screaming at her to turn back, but something compelled her to step inside. As she crossed the threshold, the door slammed shut behind her, and the house exhaled with satisfaction. Far below, deep within the heart of the house, the clock began to tick faster. The cycle would begin again, forever.